If you've had a chance to play the features demo game included with AnyRPG, you've probably noticed that there are a variety of crafting skills, including alchemy, inscription, jewel crafting, blacksmithing, and more. So how do you install these skills within your own game, and how would you modify the crafting workstations and the items that you're holding while you're crafting? That's what we'll be covering in this episode. So let's get started. For this tutorial, I will be using AnyRPG Engine 0.15, which is available as a free download from anyrpg.org/downloads in Unity package format. However, you can follow along if you wish, also using the free AnyRPG Core Unity package, which is available on the Unity Asset Store. I will also be using the following third-party assets: the Mega Fantasy Props Pack for free by Carboose X, which just gives us a nice little scene in which to do our crafting, and also the Alchemy Lab Props for free by Manastation, which has a really nice alchemy workbench that we can use to demo how to make your own crafting workstations. When you install the Alchemy Lab props, you'll notice that there isn't any content in there by default, so you will have to choose one of the Unity packages included with it. In this case, I'm just going to use the Lab props built-in Gamma, since AnyRPG does not yet support URP or HDRP. And when you double click on that, you can just click Import, and it'll create a new directory in your project called Multi-Story Dungeons 2, where the actual content and prefabs can be found. To create the sample game, I will go to the Tools menu and choose AnyRPG Wizard, New Game Wizard. Then I will call the game Crafting and set the first scene name as Castle, and click the Copy Existing Scene box. Then open up the Mega Fantasy Props pack and go to the Example Scenes folder and pull in the Castle wireframe scene and click Create. Once the New Game Wizard has completed, I need to run the Template Wizard by going to Tools, AnyRPG Wizard, Template Content Wizard, and there is actually a good deal of template content that we need to install for this demo. First, I'm going to install all Crafting Skills template package, which will include all of the crafting skills included with AnyRPG. There is a minor bug in AnyRPG version 0.15 where the blacksmithing audio didn't get installed with that first template, so we're just going to install the weapon sound effects template package, which is where it is. That will be fixed in future versions. Next, we need to install some recipes, so I am going to install the leather equipment blue recipes template package, as well as the all leather equipment brown recipes template package, and this will give the recipes for the blue and brown leather gear. I am also going to install the base crafting woodworking recipes template package so that we get the woodworking recipes. And I am also going to install the base crafting blacksmithing recipes package so that we get some blacksmithing recipes. And I'm going to install the base crafting alchemy recipes template package so we get some alchemy recipes. I am also going to install the all epic medieval weapons recipes template package so that we get the epic medieval weapon recipes as well as the recipe items, which I'll be demoing, which is a special type of item that you can learn the recipes from. I am going to also install the all epic medieval weapon items template package so that we get the weapon items as well. I am going to install a woodworking supplies vendor so that we actually have someone to purchase some crafting goods from. I am going to install the blacksmithing supplies vendor collection so that we are able to purchase the blacksmithing supplies. and I am going to install the all cheat commands template package so that we can set our character's level and gain gold to buy some of this stuff. With all of that template content, I can click install and wait for the wizard to complete. Once the template content is installed, there's a little bit of setup that we need to do on our scene. I'm going to select everything in this scene, starting from the stone half gate, which is below the zone colliders, all the way down to the bottom. And the only thing I'm going to uncheck here is the directional light. And with all of those items selected, I'm going to hit static and choose yes, change children. And this is necessary so that the nav mesh will work properly. If you don't have the navigation tab already in your scene, you can go to Window AI Navigation and it should show up. And then we can bake the nav mesh in our scene so that our NPCs can properly spawn and have somewhere to stand. Next, I am going to change some lighting settings. If you don't already have the lighting window, you can go to Window and Rendering and Lighting, and that will show up. What I need to do is I'm going to set the environment lighting source to color and just change that to something a little bit brighter. If you have it set to skybox by default, then the shadows look way too dark in the level until you've actually baked the lighting. I also want to change the sun source, so I am going to look through the scene and find the directional light and just pull that into the sun source and go to the inspector, just make sure the color and intensity looks good, and that looks pretty good. And that should be everything that I need to do, except for there is an FPS controller in the scene. I'm going to delete that because AnyRPG has its own controller. And finally, I am going to change the default spawn location. So I'm just going to middle click on the ground right about here, choose the default spawn location and click Control Alt F to set the default spawn location, so this will be where my character will spawn. Next, let's add some NPCs to the game so that we can train in different crafting skills and purchase any different reagents and items that are needed for those. So under the Games folder, under Prefab, under Unit Spawn Node Interactable Skill Trainer, I'm just going to grab the Alchemy Skill Trainer Unit Spawn Node and drag it over here in front of the castle, then rotate it around so that he's facing my character. And then I am going to go to the vendor and I'll drag the woodworking supplies vendor about over here, and same deal, just turn him around so that he is also sort of facing the character. Next, I want to make sure that the skill trainer can train all the skills and the vendor can sell everything. By default, the vendor's only going to have the woodworking supplies and the alchemy trainer is only going to have the alchemy training available. So let's go ahead and change that. I'll go to the unit profile folder, find the alchemy skill trainer unit. I will scroll down until I find the skill trainer props, and I'll just add a bunch of skills here. So we have alchemy, blacksmithing, cooking, inscription, jewelry, leatherworking, tailoring, and finally woodworking. And now that trainer will train all the skills. Next, let's edit the vendor. So I'm going to go to the woodworking supplies vendor unit, and I'll add a couple of different vendor collections to him. So by default, he'll sell the woodworking supplies. Let's also make him sell the blacksmithing supplies, and let's also make him sell the epic medieval weapons. Now with that scene setup done, let's take a look at how skills and abilities actually work in AnyRPG. Under my crafting game resources folder, we will find a skill folder, and if we go to the crafting folder and click on one of the skills, you can see that a skill basically just teaches abilities. So each of the trade skills included will teach one ability right now, although you could make them teach multiple. For example, if you wanted to split out blacksmithing into something like smelting and blacksmithing, you could do that if you wanted. And each of these abilities is a special type of ability called a craft ability. So if we look for the base ability professions crafting, we can see we have an alchemy ability, and it's a special type of ability called a craft ability. If you wanted to add your own new crafting ability, you could go to Tools, AnyRPG's ability, and Craft ability, and just make sure that's created anywhere under the base ability folder. Let's take a look at how some of these work, specifically the way that the audio is set up on these abilities. So let's start with blacksmithing. If we look at blacksmithing, you can see that blacksmithing has an animation hit audio profile called blacksmithing. What this means is that the sounds will be played in response to animator events. So let's go look at that animation hit audio profile of blacksmithing, which is under the audio profile folder, under sound effect, and under, I think it's actually under weapons in this case because it was actually put in the wrong spot in this version. So you can see that the blacksmithing audio has a number of audio clips, and what happens is every time an audio clip is requested, it's just going to choose a random one from this list. Now let's take a look at the blacksmithing animation. So if we go to the animation profile under professions, we can see blacksmithing animation, and that is using the AnyRPG crafting hammering animation. If we look at this crafting hammering animation, we can see that he's basically holding a hammer and smacking it. And if I double click on the animation, you can see there's a bunch of animation events. So every time one of these animation hit events is called, then it's going to play one of those random sounds from the audio profile, and I have inserted these events manually so that they match up exactly with the animation. Next, let's take a look at the woodworking skill. So we'll go back down to the base ability crafting and woodworking ability. Now you can see in here that we also have animation hit audio profile, and it's set to woodworking, and we have loop audio checked, but this one is configured slightly differently. Let's take a look at that. So if we look at the woodworking animation, then it is using an animation called AnyRPG Saw Wood. Let's take a look at the Saw Wood animation. So basically, he's going to start sawing about here on the animation, and he's going to continue until about there, and it's done. Now, this is approximately 5 or 6 seconds, but the actual sound clip for this is a loop that only lasts about 2.5 seconds, which is why that loop box was checked. So if we go to the animation profile here, to the animation, and we look at it, we can see that there is a start audio animation event and a stop audio animation event. So instead of doing animation hits, which is just going to use the play one shot feature, then this is actually going to set the animator or the audio effect, and it's going to basically set it to loop on whatever audio output source it's using, and then the start audio is going to tell it to start playing that loop, and the stop audio is going to tell it to stop playing that loop. Finally, there is one more way that we can configure the audio, and that is a casting audio. So let's take a look at, for example, the inscription ability. You can see that the inscription ability, we have a casting audio profile name of inscription. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So if we look at the inscription audio, it's just going to do this audio clip called writing. Now this particular audio clip is about 4.5 seconds long, so it's pretty much matching exactly to what we need as part of that animation. Let's go ahead and look at the animation profile for inscription. So I'll look at inscription animation, and it's actually using slicing bread, but it works pretty good for inscription. If we look at this, it is basically about 4.5 seconds long, pretty much exactly the same length as the audio effect. So we're just going to play that normally. There are no need for any particular animation events. So we can see that the audio basically starts about there when he starts moving his hand and should stop pretty much right at the end of the animation. So that is the way that you can use animation, either in response to individual hit events, a start and stop as a loop, or just a non-animation event responsive audio that's just going to play immediately as soon as the animation starts. Next, let's look at prefab profiles for the crafting skills. So if I go down once again to base ability and crafting, and look at, for example, the inscription ability, we can see that we have two holdable objects. We're going to be holding a feather pen in our right hand and an inscription scroll in our left hand. And next, let's look at blacksmithing ability. With the blacksmithing ability, you can see that we are only going to hold the blacksmithing hammer in our right hand. This is basically just a reference to a prefab profile. So if we go down to the prefab profile folder and look under tool and look under blacksmithing hammer, then it is just going to use this medieval tool hammer handle. That is sort of a high-level overview of how the abilities are configured. Let's take a look at recipes next. We can find the recipes under the resources folder by scrolling down until we find recipes, and I'm going to look at the leatherworking recipes first. Each of these recipes has an option to be auto-learned, which means your character will just automatically learn this as soon as he is the correct level. Recipes have a list of crafting materials, which are just items, and you can say which items you want and how many of each are needed in order to craft the recipe. And then for the item output, that is a single item that is going to be output, but you can output multiple of that item. In order to associate a recipe with a specific trade skill, then you just set the craft ability name to whatever the trade skill that you want is, and then your character will automatically learn those at the correct level if the auto learn box is checked. Let's make an alteration here. The brown leather recipes we're going to leave at default of required level 1, and the blue leather recipes we're going to set to a required level of 2, meaning that our character will not learn them until he is level 2. Let's see how that looks in the game. For that, we are going to need to add a leatherworking workbench to the scene. So under my games folder, under prefab, under interactable crafting, there is a leatherworking table. I'm just going to pull that into the scene right here, and this is what we will interact with in order to actually perform the leatherworking. Once in the game, I will go talk to the trainer. I will learn leatherworking, and then I'm going to run over to the leatherworking table, and if I right click it, you can see that I only know the brown leather recipes. Let's use one of those cheat codes that I installed with the template content to set our level to level 2. We'll go back to the leatherworking table, and now you can see that the blue leather recipes showed up. Let's look at another way that you can learn recipes. In my resources folder under recipe blacksmithing weapon, you can see that we have a bunch of epic medieval recipes. However, auto learn is not checked on them. And that's because these recipes are going to be learned from a specific item called a recipe item. So we can go to item, consumable, and recipe, and you can see that this is a special type of item called a recipe item, and at the very bottom there is a field called recipe name. So this is a consumable item that will go in your inventory, and when you right click on it to use it, it will disappear out of your inventory, and then you will learn this recipe. Let's go ahead and set up a vendor collection so that we can actually purchase these things from one of the vendors. So I am going to look for the Epic Medieval Weapons vendor collection. I am going to Control D to duplicate that and call it Epic Medieval Weapon Recipes vendor collection, and then also change the resource name to Epic Medieval Weapon Recipes. And then I am going to click on the resource selector there, and instead of Epic Medieval Bow, I'll choose Epic Medieval Bow Recipe, do the same thing for the crossbow, and do the same thing for the dagger, do the same thing for the axe, and that's good enough for this demo, so I'm just going to set that to 4, so we'll just have 4 recipes to purchase. I will then add those to the unit profile for the woodworking supplies vendor by once again scrolling down to the bottom, and at the end I'm going to add the Epic Medieval Weapon Recipes. I'm going to add a blacksmithing forge to the scene to support this. So under my game folder, under prefab and spawnable interactable crafting, I am just going to delete this existing stump over here and then pull a blacksmithing forge over there instead. Let's take a look at how that works in the game. In the game, I am going to learn the blacksmithing skill. And I'm going to go over to the woodworking supplies vendor, and from the drop-down list at the top I am going to choose the Epic Medieval Weapon Recipes. You can see that these cost money and I don't have any money, so I'm going to use another cheat code to give myself, say, 1,000 gold, and now I can actually afford these recipes. I have the recipes in my inventory now. If I walk over to the blacksmithing forge, you can see that I have the ingot recipes available to me and nothing else. So I will open up my bag and I will click on the Epic Medieval Dagger recipe. Now when I go to the blacksmithing forge, you can see the Epic Medieval Dagger. It requires 1 steel ingot to craft. So let's go ahead and buy a steel ingot or 2. So I'll go to the blacksmithing supplies and pick up a couple of steel ingots. If I look at the Epic Medieval Dagger recipe, you can see that it has 1 holdable object, and that holdable object is a steel ingot. If you recall from earlier, the blacksmithing skill also had a blacksmithing hammer, so we can combine both the holdable object from the recipe and the holdable object from the skill in order to give us a little bit of variety. In this way, you can have a hammer in your hand always and a slightly different object in your hand depending on what you're crafting. So let's take a look at that. I will click on the Epic Medieval Dagger and click Craft, and you can see that I've got a steel ingot in my hand and that blacksmithing hammer. Let's take a look at the steel ingot holdable object. That's just a prefab profile. So if I go to prefab profile prop crafting blacksmithing and look at the steel ingot prefab, it's referring to the steel ingot handle. If I double click on the steel ingot handle, you can see that it basically just has a cube in it with a certain texture applied to it. There's this disabled object here called a handle, and this handle is basically about the size of a human hand. So you can imagine if the character has his arms stretched out forward and his fingers wrapped around this, the Z-axis is where the front of the fingers would be, and the X-axis is the right-hand side of the hand, and the Y-axis is up. We're going to make sure we disable that so we can't see it. When the character is holding the ingots with the blacksmithing animation, his fingers are actually wrapped sort of downwards around this, so it works out pretty good. What would happen if we wanted to change that so that we were holding something other than a steel ingot? To do that, we can go back to the recipe. Let's look at the Epic Medieval Dagger recipe, and instead of the holdable object being a steel ingot, we can just change the holdable object to medieval dagger. Once again, if I look at the prefab profile and this is going to be this time under weapon and under dagger. I can find the medieval dagger prefab. If I click on medieval dagger, we can see a medieval dagger handle. And once again, there's that little handle thing there just to let you know sort of where the hand will be so that you can position the item properly inside of this handle. So with that change made, we should be able to actually craft the dagger, but instead of having a steel ingot in our hand, we will actually have the dagger in our hand. Now when I click on the blacksmith forge and attempt to craft the dagger, you can see that my character is actually holding the dagger in his hand as he crafts it. Next, let's look at some ways that we can modify the crafting workstations. I'm going to go to the games folder in my project, and under prefab, under interactable crafting, I'm going to click on that leatherworking table, double click on it to open it up, and take a look at how it's configured. First, you can see that there is this interactable range here. What this is it's a trigger for if you're using the gamepad. So anytime your character walks inside of this, he'll get the option to interact with the interactable. Right now, this is using the default interactable unit. You'll notice that this is an inanimate unit rather than just an interactable, and the inanimate unit class basically just adds the nameplate to it, so that's why we have that nameplate with the icon over top of it, rather than just this being something like one of those gathering nodes which didn't have a nameplate or any icon over top of it if you've watched the gathering tutorial. It also has one crafting node script attached to it with an ability name of leatherworking. Let's add another one of those. So I will add a second crafting node, and this time I am going to give it the ability name of woodworking. Now let's save that and go back into the game. If I look at the leatherworking table, I don't see anything above it right now other than the name, the same way that, for example, I have that icon above the blacksmithing forge. So I'll go over to my trainer and I will learn leatherworking. And now you can see that it shows a leatherworking icon. I will go over to the trainer again and I will learn woodworking. And now it's got a different icon. This is basically the multi-interaction icon. And if I right click on it, we see the options for leatherworking. So I can pull up the leatherworking recipes. And I can also look at the woodworking recipes and perform woodworking here. So let's go ahead and just buy a couple of ash logs, for example. And this is similar to the way that the blacksmithing worked, where woodworking is always going to use a saw, and then depending on what recipe you're using, it's going to have a different holdable object for the logs. So you could see that that audio was approximately aligned with what we saw happening in the animation. And similarly, let's go ahead and craft another one of these daggers. And you could hear all of those animation hit events that I was demonstrating earlier. Lastly, I want to demonstrate how you would actually change the model for one of these workstations. These tables are pretty basic, so what if you wanted a fancy table like the alchemy table that's included in that alchemy pack that we installed? I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate the basic alchemy table, and I'm going to just call this one Fancy Alchemy Table. I'm going to double click to open it up, and you can see that inside we've got the basic sort of like low resolution alchemy workbench. Let's look down under Multi-Story Dungeons 2, under Props, and I believe it's under Furniture, and there should be a Table Preset 1, which is what I want to use. So I'm going to drag this underneath the default interactable unit, and I am going to right click on the transform and just reset it. So now there it is. I'm going to delete the medieval alchemy table, and now we have our fancy table underneath there. I am going to right click on the box collider and just go copy component, because it's important that the box collider for the actual interactable unit matches the right shape. and we can see that this shape is a little bit off. It's matching where the old alchemy workbench shape was. So I'm going to right click on this box collider and just go paste component values, and now this box collider matches, and that allows us, when we actually move our mouse over and click on this, to actually interact with it. And then you can see the larger box for walking into range if you're using a gamepad. If this inner box didn't match up properly, then what would happen is maybe if we moved our mouse to the edge of the table, we wouldn't be able to interact with it until we were actually inside of the box collider. So that's why you want to make sure that that box collider matches. And that is how you can replace the actual graphic that's showing there. Let's go ahead and drag an alchemy workbench into the scene. I'm just going to stick it inside this building here because it seems to me like, it's got a couple books and stuff on it, so maybe we don't want it to get wet. So let's go find it under the prefab folder, interactable crafting, and I can drag my fancy alchemy table into the scene here. And let's just go into the game and press play and make sure that that's all working properly. Once in the game, I will go to the alchemy trainer. This time I will learn alchemy from him, and then I can run over to the building and go to my new fancy alchemy workbench and right click on it, and you can see that I get the alchemy recipes. You can see that this thing is glowing yellow. There is a difference between the way the leatherworking table works and the way that the alchemy workbench works. To see that, I actually have to learn leatherworking so that the leatherworking table is interactable. Notice with the leatherworking table that when I mouse over it, that only the table glows and not the items on top. This is due to the way that the leatherworking table is configured. If we collapse this stuff, you can see that the table underscore wood, which is the part that was glowing, is a child of default interactable unit. Basically, whenever you mouse over it, it's only going to search for items that are childs or children of that default interactable unit and make them glow. And since the rest of these items are not children but siblings, then that's why the wand and the dagger aren't glowing. And if you wanted to make the item not glow, for example, let's say we just wanted the fancy alchemy table to not glow, we can go to default interactable unit here, and what we can do is we could potentially just drag this table preset right out of there, but the easier way to do it is to uncheck glow on mouse over. Now, back in the game, you can see that I can mouse over the alchemy workbench and I get the tooltip showing up beside the system menu at the bottom center of the screen, and I can right click to interact with it and see the recipes, but it's not glowing. I think that's good enough for this tutorial, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I definitely hope that you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to thumbs up the video and subscribe to the AnyRPG YouTube channel. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video.